So, hello and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us for this online lecture on religion and faith at the Royal Hospital for Neuro-disability. We are particularly delighted to welcome Carl Banks, who will be presenting to us today. He has been a volunteer with the RHN since 2023, as a transcriber for our admissions registers. And more recently, for 6 months, he's been the on-site volunteer archive researcher on our Legacy of Care 170 Years at the RHN project. Since 2025, Carl's worked at the University College London's Institute of Neurology in the Queen Square Library and Archives. And previous to that, Carl has worked in various specialist health and medical libraries and archives. Following Carl's talk, we'll be welcoming Pastor Jeff Coyne. He is our current chaplain, and he's the 15th in a very long line of chaplains at the RHN. He's actually been head of the chaplaincy here for 20 years now. So we're very happy to welcome Jeff. And then finally, we have Sarah Hayward here, who is a project manager, and she'll be joining us with any questions and answers that you have at the end of this lecture. So do put them in the chat or the Q&A tab at the bottom. We hope to have about 10 minutes at the end to answer any questions that you may have. We won't be able to hear or see you, so do just type them in for us, and we hope we can get to all your questions. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Carl. Thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Today, as you know, our talk is about religion and faith at the hospital. I'm going to say Royal Hospital, which covers all the different names that the hospital has had over time. It just makes it easier. I might say RH as well in abbreviations. So here we go. So here's an overview of the presentation. I'll give you some idea about what the project was about and why we were doing it and where the inspiration for the theme came from. I'll be touching upon all the different archival sources, both specifically and throughout the presentation, and then moving through to the first foundations of religion and faith in the hospital, moving through time to the present day. This will cover a whole range of people and events and experiences and controversies, covering applicants, pensioners, patients and residents, all the various chaplains that we have been able to find information on, things around the services, the chapel and the spiritual spaces and the music, and then finally, but not least, interspersed throughout the talk will be elements of fundraising, philanthropy, and bequesting endowments. So to start off then, the central focus of the project has always been about the hospital's patients, both past and present, whose voices are often underrepresented in heritage discourse. And so it was really important to find those missing stories and those people and bring those to light. Another part of the project was strengthening public and academic understanding of the hospital's history itself and its importance and place in medical and social history. So to do that, we gathered together historical content, create a series of oral history interviews and recordings that were both standalone and as part of a documentary film. And there's also a dedicated website, which you will find a Legacy of Care, on which you'll also find the videos and the blog articles that myself and other volunteers and others have written. We also organised a number of archive-inspired events for patients and staff at the hospital with great success, and also laid down the foundation for further archival work. So my role specifically was a day a week for almost 6 months, where I extensively researched the archives at the Royal Hospital to identify key individuals and to gather material related to aspects of life there. This provided important historic context and prompted discussion in workshops with patients and staff and material for the documentary film. This involved in-house evidence and sources being investigated, including the early admission case registers, board and committee meeting minutes, fundraising appeals, matrons' journals, photographs, audiovisual collections, and of course, the religious service records. External sources have included Ancestry.com, the newspaper, British Newspaper Archive, contacts in the Lambeth Palace Archives, as well as general online content, especially for images. I was also able to get involved in project work, such as helping in the workshops, writing blogs on this theme and other themes, adding to the sum of knowledge about what we know about the Royal Hospital, the people who have lived and worked there, and to the present day. So the inspiration itself came from one of the workshops with patients and staff. So again, it's very much patient-led. It's been front and centre throughout all of the research that we've been doing and the outputs that have followed. I was able to go to the archives, return with snippets of information, hopefully to generate further discussions to feed in. And we identified all sorts of gaps in our knowledge of the hospital's history. So then, this is the story of the spiritual life at the hospital from its unique archives and wider sources. So right from the beginning, the ethos has been undenominational, it says here, but it starts with people of faith at the helm. They are influencing, they are making decisions, they are creating the Royal Hospital as we know it. They are also administering to the spiritual and faith needs of patients, residents, visitors, and staff alike. So initially, and predominantly, it was very much Church of England, non-conformist. However, right from the outset, the Royal Hospital has welcomed other Christian denominations of faith, and this is especially true of today. For instance, where we have Jewish, Methodist, Muslim, and Roman Catholic religious needs also being met. More on that later. Also, in the early days, much of the Royal Hospital's fundraising was through early Christmas appeals. And these really did have a religious tone and language, very much of its time, at its core. So let's move on to the people. First and foremost, of course, is the Reverend Dr. Andrew Rood, minister, philanthropist and social reformer, who was the founder of the hospital in 1854. He was also its first secretary. His background prior to the creation of the hospital was as nonconformist minister based in East London. He was politically active, but most notably in social causes. From 1813 onwards, he founded 6 different institutes to help with the poor, the sick, the incurable, which is a term that was used very much at the time, and helpless. He was also a popular religious author of literary works. He resigned his ministry in 1861 because I think probably a lot of his time was spent dealing with the Royal Hospital and Home for Incurables, Putney as it was called then. This was his last love and the one that gave him most anxiety, apparently. There is a lot more information about the Reverend Dr. Andrew Reid on these 2 websites. Both on our own archive website here, where you'll find a brilliant preface and summary of all the things he did. And there's also a YouTube video of the life and times of Reverend Dr. Andrew Reid. So, who else was involved? Well, we've got 2 presidents of the Royal Hospital. Their Graces the Archbishops of Canterbury and Charles Thomas Longley, who served for 3 years. Followed by Archibald Campbell Tate, serving for a lot more. Unfortunately, it was never a hat trick or a mitre trick, there's such a thing, with the following Archbishop, who was Edward White Benson, who said a big resounding no. But his reasoning was that an institution of this magnitude required a resident chaplain. So, going round on the pictures, we've got Charles Thomas Langley top left, and on the next to him, that's Tate. Benson at the bottom. And at the bottom is a picture of the assembly room. And there you'll see, right after the second arch, very small, is the foundation stone, which Campbell Tate was a part of the whole ceremony, along with the first royal patron of the hospital, Edward, His Royal Highness Prince of Wales. Now, nicely segued into the other royal patrons, who were also heads of the Church of England. So right from King Edward VII right through to Queen Elizabeth II, in a continual successive line, these were all patrons of the hospital. First and foremost, we obviously had George VII, who supported until 1936. Queen Elizabeth herself was very actively involved in the hospital, visiting on many occasions, including opening the Chatsworth Wing, Draper's Wing, and the UK's first dedicated brain injury unit on Clifton and Devonshire wards. However, that's where the buck has stopped, because as of this month, the Royal Hospital found that Their Majesties, following a comprehensive review of the royal patronages, His Majesty the King will not be able to continue the patronage of our hospital at this time. So, very sad news indeed. So, we wonder who will be the next patron. So, moving on then, as I said, first and foremost, this project was really about finding the voices of patients. So here we've got applicants who were applying to be either a pensioner of the hospital or an inmate or patient of the hospital or a resident. So looking at the admission records, we find that there are a number of individuals who are connected to both religious people, either through terms of employment, or they themselves are involved in their communities and local societies. There are a number of religious people who were also involved in supporting the applications and the applicants, and also when an applicant was pushed back, quite often there'd be a letter from perhaps a local curate, a local vicar, who would support their application, and then that would often go forward to the next stage, which was the election stage. Quite often you find that there are people of faith who are nominated as financial backers or securities, and they're also occasionally recipients of the pensions, care of the pensioners themselves. And of course, this whole process of applying to be a pensioner or a patient or resident took time, and sometimes it took its toll as well. And occasionally deaths are reported by usually the local vicars as well. But there are some named individuals from one example, one admissions register example, for example, we know of a coachman who was employed by the Bishop of Lichfield. And there was an Alice Hastings who was recorded as being adopted by the Reverend Dr. Bigsby, Knight of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. And there was an Elizabeth Haddy who became a hospital pensioner in 1890, and she was a housekeeper for the Vicar of St. Germans in Cornwall. So the vast majority then were unnamed and unidentifiable, alas. However, and we also have in the Christmas appeals, when published annually by the hospital, a number again of individuals. In this one, it says she works by the Christian sunshine of her happy manner and by the distribution of tracts and booklets in her letters, and in any way she can. She thinks she has a ministry to fulfill in her limited way for her beloved Master, Jesus Christ. So this kind of is a tone and description which is repeatedly portrayed, where patients or applicants are described as good, happy, uncomplaining Christian souls, and no doubt this was purposely aligned with charitable and philanthropic means in order to raise funds from a faith-loving public. So it's very much a religious sentiment of the time. Quite often, the description in the early fundraising appeals is that of a patient strengthened in their faith through their sufferings, whether physical, mental, emotional, social, financial, all of those things. And we have lots of examples of those where individuals are unnamed. We're quite fortunate, though, in having this particular image and chap, who is described as a child of nature by his friend, the Reverend Edwin Paxton Hood, who Edwin wrote one of the Christmas appeals. He describes his friend as an avid reader who was mainly self-educated and a published writer, and he wrote a collection of sermonettes for the Children's Hour. For this publication, he was unpaid and later uncredited, and it was used by a very highly popular minister in a large church in one of the most considerable of the English cities. He shares one of the many hymns of this child of nature, but it's interesting that we were able to link this image to an individual applicant. Beckley, who in the end does become a resident of the hospital. Of course, there are the staff as well, who are always ready to go the extra mile. So in terms of services and music, they have been hugely involved in the hymns and carol services. They have also played the organ in the assembly room, and they've attended services themselves as people of faith. They've also been involved, of course, with the logistics of moving or assisting in moving patients in wheelchairs or with difficulties standing up and walking, for example, to the Holy Trinity Church, which is next door to the hospital, or to the assembly room, of which we have a picture here, or even to the chapel, which was a small room on the first floor later on. They've also been involved in the Christmas celebrations and the other main festivals of the year, either dressing up as in this lovely picture here, involved in staff and patient choirs, gift giving, for example, by the matron, or helping with the fundraising philanthropic side of things at the garden parties, which happened on an annual basis for very many years. In one case, staff also went along with some patients to Lourdes in the 1970s, 90s, I'm not sure exactly what date. So they have been involved in lots of different ways, both celebratory and very practical, and they're also in their own individual right. So moving on to the chaplains. So this is an overview of all the chaplains. At the beginning of the project, little was known about any of them. Maybe perhaps not so much our last one, Pastor Coyne. And so there was lots of bits of information all over the place, here and there. The first key source was from G.C. Cook in his book, The History of the Royal Hospital for Neuro-disability. And there was an Appendix 1 listing 13 chaplains from 1858 to 2004. Actually, 2 of those people were the same person. They just got promoted. Since then, this is now the full picture. Since the research that I undertook, I also discovered that there was a missing chaplain, and he's now been included. He's the second one here on the page, Barker Simpson. More on him in a second. So now I'm going to introduce each of the chaplains and intersperse that with some of the key stories of their times. So the first chaplain then of the Royal Hospital was the Honourable and Reverend Robert Henley. He was the longest serving of them all, over some 42 years of service. He somehow balanced this role alongside his own parochial duties as Vicar of Putney, his home life, and also found time to publish some of his sermons. One, for example, is called Saintliness, a course of sermons on the Beatitudes, preached at St Mary's Church, Putney. Henley was the third son of an MP, peer and writer, his namesake, the Honourable and Reverend Robert Henley, and his mum, Lady Harriet Nee Peel. She was the daughter of Sir Robert Peel, 1st Baronet, and sister of Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel, 2nd Baronet. They're quite an esteemed and eminent family, right in the hub of Victorian Britain. On the 1st of June, 1852, the younger, our chaplain, Henley, married Emily Louisa Aldridge, and together they had 8 children, and they lived locally in Putney most of their life. Working for 42 years, up to the age of 68 and beyond, with all of these balancing acts that he had to do, it's no wonder that Reverend Henley helped set wheels in motion for a permanent chaplain. So alongside Archbishop Benson, who we mentioned earlier, who said that an institute of this size required a resident chaplain, it's no wonder that the time was right as we moved into the 20th century. However, before we move on, things aren't always quite as they seem in the Henley household. I found one article called Sobering the Cook, where the cook clearly had started on the Christmas dinner a little bit too early and a little bit vigorously. She's in court with Honourable and Reverend Robert Henley, Vicar of Putney, charged with assault. He was redeemed, and the cook admitted having had some gin, but was denied that she was insensibly drunk. The case was dismissed. So we have an interesting overlap here between Henley, who was essentially a volunteer chaplain, to moves to kind of create a new arrangement. One of the board members, Sir Massey Stopes, suggested the creation of a chaplain endowment fund, essentially for a Church of England chaplain. If it was supported by the board, and if they would pay £50, which is equivalent to about 5,600 in today's money, from the general fund, he would donate £1,000. That's the equivalent of £111,000 in today's money. He did add in his codicil, however, that if the board should fail to carry out this, he would go to the council hospital for the same purpose. Of course, the board agreed unanimously, and the deed of gift was created, investing in London and North Western Railway, Devonshire stock, under 4 trustees' names, and the interest was to be used for purposes of creating a chaplain role. There's lots of toing and froing about this. Henley is still working as a chaplain, but he does help to find this additional one. The agreement seems to be a very good one because it's in place for some 60 years, and it does actually set the precedent for having a brand new full-time resident chaplain. And the first set of rules and duties were created accordingly. So from the endowment, we have first set of rules which were created. Following those, they were in place for a good 38 years. The creation of a handbook of rules, swiftly followed by a 1944 edition, which didn't really include many changes, was introduced. And then in the 1960s, a whole new system was changed for funding the curate, the chaplain of the hospital. However, the basic rounds were pretty much the same. It involved prayers, visiting patients, services, special services, extra charismal duties, and reporting to the House Committee as necessary. Our missing curate is the Reverend S. Barker Simpson. He appears a couple of years after the new arrangement for a curate came into place. We don't actually know the name of that person. However, I found the evidence for this chaplain in newspaper articles published in August 1983. What we do know about him is that he was a rector of Cold Norton, Essex previously, but it's a mystery as to whether he did start his role or why he's missing from the archives. We next have the Reverend Cecil Tate Bellars, or Bellows. There seems to be confusion over his last name. Some records say one thing, some records say the other. However, he spent less than 4 years in service at the hospital, perhaps only 2. His previous roles were in 5 London churches, Devon, St Leonard's on Sea and Brighton. And quite typically of all of our chaplains is that they covered the absences of other local clerics. So in this case, he covered for Reverend E. Griffiths in Mortlake, which is near Putney, where the hospital is. I've actually kind of plumped with Bellows as the final name because this is the one that seems to be used most often, and it appears in the Crockford's Clerical Directory, which is the authoritative directory of Anglican clergy. Now, we have next the Reverend Digby Gritton, MA, who is large-hearted and universally loved. He is quite an extraordinary chaplain, mainly because I think we can piece more information about him, but he seems to have been an exceptional cleric and all-rounder. He was at the hospital, provided 31 years of service. He introduced Bible classes, and he introduced patient-recommended speakers for events that happened at the hospital. He also recorded high attendance rate to services, and that's definitely been evidenced through the archives. He was a keen cricketer, and in the First World War, he was a soldier seeing action in Egypt predominantly. He was also an officiate at society weddings and funeral, and he was much loved in the fact that he was quite often a guest speaker at school prize days. And in one school in particular, he was an award was named after him in tribute. That was the St. Francis School in Acton. He was also a husband, a father of 2 daughters, Doris and Lois. Here are some examples of some of the evidence I've been able to collate about Digby. On the top left, we've got his army record, where he did actually win medals for his service, military service. He attended the late Marquis of Northampton, who was president of the Royal Hospital's funeral. He conducted that. The cheeky picture in the top right is from one of the hospital business appeals, and that's of him, apparently him, and the steward of the hospital arranging sports for one of the fundraising dates. The scripture in the bottom left is commemorative prize. And there are lots and lots of quotes, both in the hospital's archives and in the press, saying how wonderful he was as a chaplain and how much loved his services were. Our next chaplain is the Reverend Charles Roy Stafford Finch. Before joining the hospital, he held posts in a number of places, including mainly in London area, but also in Gibraltar and St Albans. He is one of our shortest serving chaplains, spending only a year in service. And after this point, he resigned his position to take up parish work again. This, of course, is during the beginning of the Second World War in London, where obviously the Blitz was happening. So I do wonder if he kind of wanted to be in the thick of things. But I think more research is needed on that. Our next chaplain is a medical and spiritual man. So Hugh Neville Keeling, MCRSLRCP, was, we know, born in 1877, raised and baptised in Bradford. He registered medically in 1902 when his surgical career began. He was a surgeon working in Whitby, Leeds, Nuneaton, in St Mary's Hospital in Eastbourne. And he held a number of distinguished posts, including late honorary surgeon and resident obstetric officer at the General Infirmary at Leeds. He also appears to have been an agent Coast Guard, and I'm guessing that this is when he lived in the Whitby area. He was ordained in 1938 and became the chaplain of St Mary's Hospital in Eastbourne, and beginning duties as the Royal Hospital's chaplain in 1941. Just before that, though, one of the newspaper articles I found was that he officiated at the wedding of one John William Bailey and Peggy Turner in Eastbourne. And John was the leader of the Eastbourne National Fire Service, who was later killed during a German air raid in 1943. So during his tenure at the Royal Hospital, it's very much the thick of things in World War II. The daily round of visiting and prayers and services continue on. There's a very interesting snippet from one of the annual reports from the hospital, which reads, "On Sunday morning, July the 2nd, as our chaplain was about to give the number and first line of a hymn, the rapid approach of a flying bomb was heard, the noise growing louder and louder. The chaplain raised his voice to the utmost limits as he read the first line of the hymn, 'Put thou trust in God.' The organist and patients rose to the occasion magnificently with the loud pedal of the organ down and at the top of their voices. This very appropriate hymn was sung by the patients and the roar of the robot was drowned." I think that kind of portrays quite a magnificent image of resistance and faith, which is pretty astounding, I think. And of course, there was an evacuation of patients and staff from the hospital. Nearly half of them were evacuated to Lennox Castle Emergency Hospital in Lennoxtown, Glasgow. The train journey itself must have been logistically challenging, but it was definitely a trying experience. So it's quite lovely to hear that it was softened by the utmost kindness of the local hospital staff and neighbouring community. Those who remained at the hospital were moved to the ground and basement floors, leaving the top 2 stories unaccommodated. Reverend Keeling visited the evacuated patients and staff up in Glasgow, as did a few members of the board. We also hear during his tenure that a new chapel is created and dedicated by Dr. Pimpson, Bishop of Southwark. This is the first time we hear of a specific dedicated chapel space in the hospital for patients and staff. The next period, the next 13 years, are quite a bumpy time. There are complaints, there's challenges, there's conversions, there's change, centenaries. These three chaplains cover that particular period. And our first one, Reverend Keith Thomas Mackin, seems to have an exceptionally bumpy time. There were complaints about his dereliction of duty, which was of grave concern to the House Committee, to whom he reported, who then also reported then to the board. And they instructed him that he should pay particular attention to this most important side of his work and visit all patients at regular and frequent intervals. He was later interviewed during his tenure about the accounts of post office savings books, Chapel Fund and Offertree Fund. However, there's no evidence of misdemeanour and no further explanation as why this request was asked of the board by the board and what happened next. Except we do know that he did resign not long afterwards, giving 3 months' notice and agreeing to fill the vacancy with a temporary chaplain without cost to the hospital. However, on the plus side, it seems that Mackin introduced Holy Communion in the wards itself, according to a very definite plan, and as patients requested. He was also involved with the patients' choir and tried to form a small committee looking at domestic social activities for patients. He also helped tidy up the free church denominations set up, covering Congregational, Methodist, and Baptist denominations. Our next chaplain, the Reverend Basil Loney, we get a bit of an insight into how the curates and chaplains were recruited. In this case, the board wrote to the Bishop of Southwark to find Mackin's successor, and Loney had been a previous applicant, and alongside another applicant, they were interviewed by the House Committee, and Loney got in. I think probably because he had experience at three other hospitals, at Dulwich Hospital, St Mary Abbott's Hospital, Kensington, and Grove Hospital, Tooting. He was in service for about 4 years and conducted the Centennial Thanksgiving, to which Bishop of Kingston preached the main sermon. In his last year at the Royal Hospital, there was somewhat controversy in that he expressed profound concern about the number of patients seeking to convert to Roman Catholicism, and he specifically implicated the Catholic Irish nurses, accusing them of influencing patients unduly. Now, the records don't show any action following this, neither are there any counter-arguments from staff, or more importantly, what the patients themselves were saying about why they were changing faith, if indeed they were. During Loney's tenure as well, he also proposed that a larger chapel would be built because 12 patients in wheelchairs were not capable of fitting into the small chapel, whilst other remains outside. He seemed to have got a bit annoyed with the board, shall we say, for not replying to him, and he later said that concerts and cinemas are restarted now for the winter months in the assembly room. I feel that they do not help create the right atmosphere for the solemn services conducted in that room. Clearly, I think he's asking for that special designated space, get away from the unseemly secular entertainments that were happening in the assembly room. Our next chaplain is the Reverend Kenneth Walter Howell. Prior to joining, he is possibly one of our most well-travelled chaplains, undertaking roles in Paraguay and Chile. He was 6 years in service. He joined as a reverend and left as a reverend canon and later bishop. He's the only and first chaplain to be licensed by the Bishop of Kingston. This was a new arrangement for the hospital and the Bishop of Kingston, who was licensed in the Vicar of Wandsworth role to provide spiritual care to the patients as a part-time chaplain. So we're going back to that situation when Henley was a volunteer chaplain, juggling a number of roles, both external and internal, and somehow managing them both. There are lots of complaints about this. There are lots of concerns. The board is activated to do something about this because spiritual care is not being reached and these services aren't being fully conducted. So at this time, sorry, I should have shared that one with you. You've got some examples there about the complaints. At this time, though, a patient's bequest called the Robinson's Trust Fund took over 2 to 3 years to create. A patient, Mr. Robinson, donated the equivalent of over £421,000 worth of shares to the Royal Hospital for use to further the spiritual welfare of patients, be used with special reference to the chaplaincy services and or the building and furnishing of a new chapel. This generous anonymous donation is later referred to in 1966 annual report, where the board has reported that the building of a new chapel is beyond our means at present. We have Holy Church, Trinity Church at our very gates, which is superfluous. We suggest clever curtaining and rearrangement of the assembly room stage to possibly cut out the theatrical atmosphere of the assembly room. So I think harkening back to Reverend Loney's complaints about its inappropriateness as a space. And this generous donation will be put to use in other ways. So what happened was that the Royal Hospital with the Church of England agreed that the hospital would pay for a part-time junior curate to work core hours. And later, after those hours with the Vicar of Wandsworth, the curate would be paid £400 a year initially. They would have a 6-month probation, so all parties could decide that this is the right arrangement. And the curate would move into a hospital property, 42 Skeena Hill in Putney, when it was vacated by the current curate. And the Church of England, on its side, would provide a number of preachers and conduct services at the hospital. The first chaplain to benefit from this agreement was the Reverend Ian Saville. He had postings in Bootle, Merseyside, and Wimble, Dorset, and was again Vicar of Wandsworth, just like Henley was before. The photo on the top right, I believe, is the Reverend Saville, although there's no date and name on it, but it seems most fitting given other evidence. He helped set up the hospital's Patients' Church Council, which gave patients a say in chaplaincy services. It was interdenominational and it's chaired by Saville. Sadly, we don't have much more information beyond that at this time. The discussion keeps rumbling on about a new fit-for-purpose chapel. During this time, we get a view that Jewish patients, residents and staff are also, their spiritual needs are being catered for. As we heard, a very rare inclusion in the archive, which notes that there was a Rabbi, Dr. M. Ginsberg, who sadly passed away and who was replaced by another rabbi, Mr. Rockman. During this time, and most likely during Saville's tenure, we know that some patients and staff go on a pilgrimage to Lourdes, France. And sadly, we don't have any diaries or any information other than a couple of photos that this had occurred. So, but it's quite amazing and again quite phenomenal that this act of faith took place and was hugely supported by the hospital. Our next curate is the Reverend Thomas John Thomas. He possibly started his career in West Wales, but we don't know much else really apart from that. And the years of his tenure. In this quote, the line between complete care and being institutionalised is in the nature of things. A very thin one. Patients are very conscious of this and always want to guard against being thought of as a crowd of patients rather than individuals. Personally, I've always found it a help to think in terms of doing things with the patient rather than just for the patient. It's been a privilege and a joy to minister to them. And I think that says quite a lot about where Thomas was coming from and how patients and residents were being looked after and considered both within the hospital and perhaps kind of viewed outside the hospital too. Next, we've got the Reverend Gerard Edmund David Bonham Carter. The pictures around on this screen. In the top right, and then in the centre, we've got 38 Woodchester Terrace, W2. This is where he was born, where they moved to. His family moved to in 1931. Interestingly, it's a blue plaque place. I think a couple of artists and photographers were there. Also with great historical links to the wider world. The picture of the ship and the Canadian Pacific passenger list shows that both himself and his older brother Norman were evacuated to Canada in 1940, sailing from Liverpool to Montreal. They are registered as intending for future permanent residence in Canada on this list, and they sailed in the SS Duchess of Richmond. Now, that particular ship, although it changed name later, interestingly was requisitioned only 2 months later for military purposes for the Tizard mission, which was a mission between the UK, Canada, and the United States to share secret research and development work related to military applications. The picture on the left is a wedding picture. He married Amber J. Paris in Westminster, and then they lived in various eminent and desirable addresses around London, finally ending up in Wimbledon. The Bacon, I can never say this, Bacon Aenia is basically the Society of Francis Bacon. There's an interesting insight here that he and his wife were players at a informal gathering, musical players at an informal gathering, playing expertly selecting and playing Elizabethan string music. Amber played the viola, and apparently the Reverend Bonham Carter was a cellist as well. So quite nice little insight to perhaps some home life and the kind of wider life outside of the hospital there. Moving on. Then we have the Reverend J. Farnham, kind of bringing us much more into the close time. Unfortunately, we don't have much information about him at all. So if you do, perhaps you could drop us a line at archive@rhn.org.uk. That then takes us up to the present day. We have a chaplaincy team led by the pastor Jeff Coyne. Sorry, Jeff. And I'll be asking Jeff some questions in a second, and he'll be able to fill us in on what's been happening much more recently. So that's a bit of a whistle stop through the history of faith and religion at the hospital. So thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in following up some of the resources and looking into the archives, please have a look at our Legacy of Work, Legacy of Care website, and also the hospital's archive collections. And please drop us a line at archive@rhn.org.uk. Thank you.
So I became full-time chaplain at the RHN in 2006, but there's a little known fact that since 2003, I was a bank chaplain when I was also a church minister, coming in just for one Friday afternoon a month and doing one Sunday morning a month. So I knew Gerard. So I sort of, as he came to an end of his tenure, I was working alongside him. And I knew Joanne slightly, but she wasn't around for long. And then when Joanne left, I became the full-time chaplain. So 20 years full-time, 23 years associated with the RHN altogether.
Fantastic. How do you think things have changed since you've started work at the Royal Hospital?
Well, I think there's been a lot of change, and yet I think if we begin by saying human nature and human need is the same now as it was way back when the RHN was founded. So disability, illness still bring pain and sadness, often loss, of course, eventually. And so people still need faith support, spiritual support. So that sort of fundamental human need is still there. Nothing's changed about that. And the need to minister to, support, care for people who are struggling with life. I think where it has changed is we have, certainly within the hospital, we've become increasingly aware that we can't take the Judeo-Christian culture for granted. We have, whilst I still have about 120 people coming to church on a Sunday over 4 services, there's a lot of people who are of other faiths, and there's a lot of people who say they have no faith, but they are spiritual. So I'm dealing with, so my role is pastoral care for everybody, patients and residents, their relatives and staff, whatever faith or no faith, seeing them as individuals who need pastoral care. I run the church in the hospital, look after the church in the hospital, for 4 different types of services during the week, and 4 actually a big service Sunday morning and 4 afternoon services on a Sunday. But I also make sure people of other faiths get their support, so that other faith ministers come in. And I'm also there to make sure that people's spiritual needs are met, which is not the same as faith needs. Everybody is looking for meaning in life. Where do they fit in? How do we support them? And so there's a bigger issue, not just faith, but spirituality.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah, I completely agree. Can you, following presentation, is there anything that kind of jumped out at you, kind of seems kind of either a bit exceptional or kind of interest personally or professionally to you?
No, I think the thing that really jumped out at me was the need is the same as it always has been, and that so many of the men are doing what I do, is trying to see the whole person. So they're not so it's not just that they are they are ministering the Bible or the prayer book or the hymns or one-to-ones. They are seeing a person beyond just faith. And I think it was a thing that Reverend Thomas made about, the individual. We would say today, seeing the whole person. So, that's good.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's part of doing the archival research is adding so much more colour and elements to individuals, so they're not just a name or almost a stereotype in some cases.
Yeah.
And to kind of give life again to these stories and the experiences that the individuals and this community at the hospital has had since 1854. So it's truly remarkable.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
I mean, I think one of the big issues is that the patient group has changed. So of course we've become very much rehabilitation, assessment and rehabilitation. So I guess about a third of our patient group are here for short term, maybe 12, 16, 20 weeks for assessment, rehabilitation. And a lot of our long-term residents have been, over the certainly years I've been here, in prolonged disorder of consciousness. So either minimally conscious or in a vegetative state. And that means that it's a different type of patient group. You have to think about different ways of interacting, but you also have to recognize that even if their brain is not able to process information, as spiritual beings, you're ministering to their spirit, to their soul. And there's a spiritual transaction that takes place. Every time you read the Bible or you do a prayer or you chat with them, even if they are not able to respond back. So there's been a big change in the patient group. And a lot of people who can express themselves haven't, when they come to us for rehabilitation maybe or assessment, say they haven't been to church for a long time, but they suddenly feel the need to just find something.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense indeed.
So So the chaplaincy team, and I guess this is something is me as the chaplain. I've got a chaplain's assistant. I have an imam comes in as a bank twice a week to do one-to-ones for the Muslim patients. That's the next biggest patient group, and I have a bereavement support officer to support families and staff alongside me at the death of patients. Because when we have so many patients live with us so long, you get to love them and care for them, know them, and it's a big bereavement for the ward staff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that kind of comes across in some of the stories with some of the chaplains, where there is great kind of respect and reverence kind of attached to them, but as individual human beings, not just for them in their kind of chaplain role. And you just think that these people made real impact, genuine impact, reaching in their undertaking, doing the job that they were inspired to do.
And of course, the one big area which we do give a lot of support to is this area of ambiguous loss, whereby a lot of our patients, maybe they've got a severe brain injury, so they are in a prolonged disorder of consciousness, or maybe they have a neurological disease like Huntington's or motor neuron disease. So they are physically present, but they are maybe psychologically, emotionally absent from their families. So the families grieve the loss of somebody because they can't be the person they were.
Right.
But it's ambiguous because they're still alive. And so forth. They go grieving often for a long period of time, maybe for years, until such time as there is closure by that patient dying. And yet, whilst they might get closure of losing that person, they also grieve again because they've got to know a new person who they've come to visit day in, day out since the brain injury. And so we do a lot of work around this whole supporting ambiguous loss. I teach it to the nursing staff to enable them to understand how our relatives are feeling.
Excellent. Amazing. Yeah, I was going to ask you a question on that, so thanks for covering that one. Are you involved in any kind of work outside of the Royal Hospital, either officiating, like some of the chaplains that I've kind of referred to?
Yeah, I mean, I am 67, so I'm semi-retired. So, I mean, I spent most of my life working in IT, so I didn't become a minister till later on, not till the late 90s. I was out at work, started out life as a bookkeeper, trained as an accountant, and then tested financial software. Became a minister, had a church in Putney for years, and then came here. I still preach outside. I take funerals as a celebrant and as an independent minister. I sit on various committees as a charity trustee of a number of charities. So
your hands are completely full, just like all your predecessor chaplains. Yeah, big work.
And interesting. Just to show that we're being anchored in history. Last year, we planted a tree in memory of Kenneth Howell in the grounds.
Okay, cool. Amazing.
And a few years ago, I actually spoke at the funeral of the Reverend Bonham Carter.
Oh, wow. Excellent. So
there is this whole sense of, this continuity that we're in touch, as it were, with some of those from the past.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. That's a good point. Shall we switch to
one other thing, if I may? This is a little known fact, but the chaplaincy is still having an impact today because in March 2017, we had a CQC inspection, and one of the areas where the RHM was outstanding, the chaplaincy service provided outstanding emotional support to patients, residents, family and staff. So we still are making a big impact.
Excellent. Congratulations. That is brilliant. On that very positive note, Anna, what questions are lined up for us, please?
We do. We've got a few questions, so I'll try and cover them all. If anyone else has any questions, do pop them in the chat, and we will try and get to you. So I do have one question for Jeff, first of all. What do you find most rewarding when supporting patients with spiritual needs?
That's an incredibly hard. What I do find rewarding is that it's another faith need being met, whether I'm meeting it as the Christian minister or whether I'm just simply meeting a need that is a human need. Rather than a faith need, so a spiritual need, it is that sense of peace and maybe that sense of comfort and that sense you're able to make a difference to somebody, however you meet that need. For me, the greatest privilege is being there at a deathbed, and it's the greatest privilege in the world to be able to support a dying patient and their families and that last stage of life. And it's hard emotionally, but it brings a real sense of privilege and a real sense of you are making a difference right to the end.
Thank you. And throwing a similar question to you, Carl, what do you find the most rewarding and enjoyable about working with the RHN archives?
I think it's making connections with people directly, but then tying that together with the stories both from the past and present day. So making sense of lives in the past that we think that we probably have some understanding of or some assumptions about, and bringing those to life where they've never been discovered or they are rediscovered. And I think my time, especially being on site, was working with such warm and kind people who were ever professional, ever very, very compassionate, people who found time to stop and talk or even just say hello in the corridor. It was phenomenal just walking around that special privileged space, really, and people just saying hello and they're complete strangers. That was quite something. I think it kind of really spoke to the core of the hospital. I really enjoyed meeting the patients and the resident staff in the workshops and learning how to do oral history interviews. There were various kind of professional elements that I really enjoyed picking up, and meeting new people and making friends. I think so. I think it was all about connection and what those connections mean and how we value those. I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Carl, were there any surprising discoveries in the records?
I think so. I think in terms of the religion and faith theme, I think it was discovering this massive community going back, 170 plus years, and piecing it all together bit by bit. And I think always the controversies are kind of interesting, aren't they? Because they show whether there's friction points between individuals and where power is being played and where influence and decision making is either running people up the wrong way or there's that frustration. And I think those elements in the mid-20th century were particularly fascinating, personally, I think, because it showed that things weren't just running along as normal. It was good that there was challenge. It was good that people were requesting more or finding dissatisfaction with their lot in some ways, because I think it shows a lot more between the cracks. Otherwise, you just read, the board meeting minutes and it's all very formulaic and what have you.
A bit dry.
So, perhaps a bit. I quite like that though, because it gives you the structure, essentially. But yeah, I'd say some of that outside the religion and faith theme. There were lots of surprises. There were things like the Radio Times and BBC appeals that had gone out during the 20th century. There's a silent film which we haven't been able to get hold of from, I think, the 1920s or 30s, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, about the hospital. So there's lots of things there. It's like, you get so close to going, it's there, we know who we can talk to, but they don't have it, or they don't have it in a format that we can actually access. So yeah, there are lots of discoveries there yet to be found as well.
Thank you. Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add?
Gosh, no, I mean, fantastic. It's so nice to have something so specific that you can follow from the beginning of the hospital. I'm not sure who else you could do that with, because it's so complex, the history. But to be able to make that point of connection and go all the way through to the beginning is, amazing work. And to see it laid out, it gives you a real sense of how life has changed, but stayed the same. I think there is somewhere something about the Lord's visit. I'm going to look into that. Yeah, it rings a bell. I may be wrong, but I'm gonna dig into that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. I am conscious that we've come to the end of our time now. So firstly, thank you so much to our audience for joining us today. We run many online lunchtime lectures, so do log in for our next one. We would be delighted to have you. Carl, thank you so much for presenting to us today. Thank you honestly for the time and the work that you put into this project. It's been fascinating to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to Jeff, who's also had to pop off now, but also thank you for joining our open lecture. It'll be on our website shortly, so we will send it around to everyone. If any of your friends or colleagues have missed it, do please send it on to them. And thank you.